Family Shadows: How One Woman's Secret Investigation Exposed the Perfect Family Lie and Changed Everything. The architect of truth, she documented every family betrayal for years, then used the evidence to shatter their perfect image.
Part 1.
The Sinclair family home in Westchester County, New York, was always immaculate, much like the image my parents had carefully cultivated for 3 decades. To the outside world, we were the quintessential American success story. Dad, the respected neurosurgeon; Mom, the elegant art gallery owner; Meline, my younger sister, the Stanford-educated prodigy; and me, Rebecca, that was always the question, wasn't it? I stood at my bedroom window, watching rain streak down the glass as I clutched the wedding invitation I'd personally delivered 2 weeks ago. My parents had just called to inform me they unfortunately wouldn't be able to attend my wedding to Daniel, scheduled for next month. A critical medical conference had suddenly appeared on Dad's calendar, and Mom simply couldn't attend without him. Of course, Meline couldn't possibly come alone. Such unfortunate timing, Mom had said, her voice dripping with artificial disappointment. As if I hadn't specifically checked their schedules months in advance. As if I hadn't heard about Meline's weekend trip to the Hamptons planned for the same dates through a cousin's social media post. I studied the photographs on my dresser, evidence of a lifelong pattern I'd spent years trying to unsee. My high school graduation, where my parents had arrived late after Meline's dance recital ran long. My college acceptance to Cornell, overshadowed by Meline's perfect SAT scores a week later. The family portrait where I was positioned half in shadow, while Meline was centered in golden light. I had spent my entire life gathering evidence of my secondary status in this family, cataloging it like a private investigator building a case that would never see trial. But something had shifted when I met Daniel 2 years ago. A lawyer with a keen eye for detail and injustice, he noticed the dismissive way my mother interrupted me at family dinners, the subtle comparisons my father wove into conversations, the countless times Meline's needs superseded mine without question. "You know this isn't normal, right?" Daniel had asked after one particularly uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner. "The way they treat you versus your sister, it's like watching a psychological experiment in real time." I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the invitation on my dresser, then opened my secret file labeled Family Evidence. Inside were screenshots of text confirmations, email receipts, calendar invites, all proving my parents had received the invitation, had initially confirmed their attendance, and had no scheduling conflicts. It was a habit I developed over the years, documenting the discrepancies between what my family claimed and what actually happened. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Your future in-laws just offered to help with the flowers since your mom backed out. What should I tell them?" I smiled despite the heaviness in my chest. Daniel's parents had welcomed me with such genuine warmth that it had initially felt suspicious. I'd spent weeks analyzing their behavior, looking for hidden agendas or secret disappointments. Finding none had been both relieving and devastating, a window into what family support could actually look like. "Tell them yes," I typed back. "And thank you." I turned away from the window and opened my laptop, accessing a private document I'd been compiling for years. Inside were financial records, property deeds, and investment portfolios, information I'd gathered through careful observation and strategic conversations with family members who didn't realize what they were revealing. The document outlined the architecture of my parents' perfect life, including some financial maneuvers that existed in ethical gray areas. Not blackmail material, I reminded myself. Just insurance. Protection against the gaslighting that inevitably followed whenever I questioned the family narrative. As I closed the laptop, I noticed a small blinking light behind my bookshelf, the surveillance camera I'd installed after discovering my room had been searched multiple times when I wasn't home. I had become something of an amateur surveillance expert over the years, my childhood hobby of spy novels evolving into practical application. What my family didn't know was that their perfect daughter had learned to play their game better than they could imagine. The wedding they were choosing to miss wasn't just a celebration of my relationship with Daniel, it was the first move in a carefully orchestrated reckoning that had been years in the making. I picked up my phone and made one last call. "Uncle James? It's Rebecca." I need to talk to you about some information I've uncovered. Yes, it concerns the family trust. And yes, I have documentation. The game was finally about to begin. Part 2. The wedding was more beautiful than I had dared to hope. A garden ceremony at the Rosewood Estate in Connecticut, with willow trees swaying gently in the breeze and string lights twinkling overhead as evening descended. Daniel's parents had stepped in magnificently, with his father walking me down the aisle and his mother helping adjust my veil in the moments before the ceremony began. "I've always wanted a daughter," Mrs. Hoffman had whispered, her eyes glistening. "And you're even more wonderful than I could have imagined." I'd nearly broken down then, the simple kindness more overwhelming than all the rejections that had preceded it. But I held firm, drawing strength from the small device concealed in my bouquet, a recording apparatus capturing every moment, every guest, every conspicuous absence. The empty front row seats reserved for my parents and sister remained a silent testament to years of emotional neglect. I'd instructed the photographer to capture those vacant chairs in detail, more evidence for my growing collection. 2 days after returning from our honeymoon in Napa Valley, Daniel and I drove to my parents' house for the confrontation I'd been preparing for my entire adult life. I brought a folder containing printed screenshots of my parents' RSVP, their text messages confirming receipt of the invitation, and photos from social media showing Meline at a beach house in the Hamptons on my wedding day. "Remember," Daniel said, squeezing my hand as we pulled into the circular driveway. "You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. And you're definitely not alone anymore." The house looked as pristine as ever, with perfectly manicured hedges and gleaming windows reflecting the afternoon sun. My mother opened the door, wearing a practiced smile that faltered when she saw the folder in my hands. "Rebecca, darling, we were just about to call you." Her voice carried that familiar artificial brightness. Come in. Your father is in his study." The living room was filled with sample fabrics and color swatches, early preparations for Meline's wedding, still 6 months away. My mother had never once offered to help with my wedding planning. Dad emerged from his study, glasses perched on his nose, offering a distracted half-hug before settling into his leather armchair. "How was the honeymoon? Napa, wasn't it?" "Meline's thinking of Paris for hers, of course." I placed the folder on the coffee table and sat across from them, Daniel beside me. "I came to discuss why you missed my wedding." My mother's face immediately shifted to a practiced expression of regret. "Oh, sweetheart, we explained about your father's conference. We were absolutely devastated to miss it." I opened the folder and placed the first document on the table, a screenshot of my father's medical conference schedule, which had ended the day before my wedding. The conference ended on Friday. My wedding was Saturday. My father frowned. Well, there were networking events that continued through the weekend. I laid down the second piece of evidence, a photo of my mother's Instagram post, geotagged at their Hamptons house the morning of my wedding. Networking from the beach house? My mother's lips thinned. "Rebecca, this is ridiculous. Are you spying on us now?" "I'm establishing the truth," I replied evenly. "Something this family has had trouble with for years." I methodically presented my evidence, piece by piece. The texts confirming they'd received the invitation. The initial RSVP. The excited phone call from Meline about her weekend plans that happened to coincide with my wedding. "So, what is this?" my father finally demanded, his face flushed with anger. "Some kind of prosecution? What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" "I'm trying to understand," I said, maintaining the calm tone I'd practiced for weeks. "I'm trying to understand why my own parents would choose to miss one of the most important days of my life and then lie about it." "You're being dramatic," my mother said dismissively. "And frankly, I think this is all stemming from jealousy over Meline's engagement. We all know how competitive you've always been with your sister." The familiar gaslighting strategy. I'd anticipated it, but the words still stung. "I have never competed with Meline," I replied. "You created that competition. You've been comparing us since we were children, always finding me lacking. And I've documented every instance." I pulled out my phone and played a recording from last Thanksgiving, My father praising Meline's promotion while in the same breath questioning why I hadn't advanced further in my own career, despite my recent award for excellence in architectural design. My parents exchanged glances, their discomfort evident. "You've been recording us?" My father's voice was low, dangerous. "I've been protecting myself," I corrected, "from exactly this kind of denial." The doorbell rang, interrupting the tense standoff. My mother rushed to answer it, visibly relieved by the distraction. Meline breezed in, her fiancé Brett trailing behind her. "Oh my God, you will not believe what happened with the venue coordinator." She stopped abruptly upon seeing Daniel and me. "Oh, you're here." "We are," I confirmed. "We're discussing why our wedding had 0 family members in attendance." Meline had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable before recovering. "Well, I told you. The invitation must have gotten lost." "Stop," I said firmly. "The lies stop now. I have the delivery confirmation and your text thanking me for the gorgeous invitation right here." I tapped the folder. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Brett shifted awkwardly, clearly sensing he had walked into a minefield. "Perhaps we should go," he suggested to Meline, who shot him an irritated look. "No, I want to hear what my sister's implying," she said sharply. "Sounds like she's been building some kind of case against us." "Not a case," I replied. "Just a record of the truth." The confrontation continued to escalate as years of resentment and unspoken grievances surfaced. My parents defaulted to their usual tactics: dismissal, deflection, and turning my sister and me against each other. But for the first time, I remained steady, presenting evidence that contradicted each of their claims. When we finally left 2 hours later, nothing had been resolved. My parents remained entrenched in their denial, and Meline had stormed out after I refused to back down from my position. "That went exactly as expected," I said to Daniel as we drove away. "They'll never admit what they did." "What's your next move?" he asked, knowing me well enough to recognize this was only phase 1 of my plan. I smiled and pulled out my phone, sending a precomposed text to Uncle James. "Meeting confirmed for tomorrow. Bringing the financial documents." "Now," I said, "we moved to phase 2. What my family didn't realize was that my years of careful observation had uncovered more than just patterns of emotional favoritism. I had discovered financial irregularities in my father's practice, tax discrepancies in my mother's gallery business, and questionable movements within the family trust that was supposedly being held equally for both Meline and me. The next day's meeting with Uncle James, my father's brother and the family's attorney, would set in motion a series of revelations that would shake the Sinclair family's perfect facade to its core. As we drove home, I received a text from Meline. "Whatever you're planning, it won't work. They'll always choose me. They always have." I showed Daniel the message, and we both recognized it for what it was: the desperate lashing out of someone who sensed her privileged position was under threat. "She's never had to earn anything," I said quietly. "Love, approval, success, it's all been handed to her. She doesn't know how to fight for something that doesn't come easily." "And you've been fighting your whole life," Daniel observed. I nodded, watching the familiar streets of my childhood pass by through the car window. "But this time, I'm not fighting for their approval. I'm fighting for the truth." What I didn't tell Daniel was that I had already initiated contact with a journalist who specialized in exposing financial improprieties among the elite of Westchester County. The documentation I had gathered over years would provide more than enough material for a compelling investigation. The Sinclair family's perfect image was built on carefully maintained appearances and strategic silences. But as any good architect knows, and I had become an excellent one, when the foundation is compromised, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. And I had spent years identifying exactly where the cracks were. Part 3. The offices of Sinclair and Associates occupied the top floor of a glass-fronted building in downtown White Plains. Uncle James had founded the firm 30 years ago, bringing my father in as a silent partner when his medical practice began generating substantial wealth. The firm managed the affairs of Westchester County's elite, and its sleek, minimalist design spoke of power and discretion. I straightened my charcoal gray suit as the elevator ascended, the leather portfolio containing my documents pressed against my side like armor. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel asked, his voice low. As a fellow attorney, he understood better than most the implications of what I was about to do. "I've never been more certain of anything," I replied. Uncle James was waiting for us in the conference room, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his expression unreadable. He had always been the family member I trusted most, the only one who occasionally acknowledged the disparity in how my sister and I were treated. But even he had limits to what he would say directly about his brother's parenting. "Rebecca," he greeted me, his handshake firm. "And Daniel, congratulations again on your wedding. The photos looked beautiful." "Thank you for coming," I said, taking a seat across from him. "And thank you for being the only family member who sent a gift and a sincere apology for not attending." Uncle James nodded, his eyes reflecting a complexity of emotions. "Your message mentioned financial documents and the family trust. I must say, you've piqued my professional curiosity." I opened my portfolio and removed a sealed envelope, sliding it across the polished conference table. "Before we discuss the trust, I need your legal opinion on these documents." Uncle James raised an eyebrow but took the envelope without comment. As he reviewed the contents, his expression shifted from professional interest to concern, and finally to something approaching alarm. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I've been paying attention for a long time," I replied. "When you grow up being invisible, you learn to see everything." The documents detailed a pattern of financial maneuvers spanning 15 years, funds moved between accounts, tax write-offs for charitable donations that never reached their intended organizations, medical insurance claims for procedures that appeared to be coded incorrectly. Individually, each might seem like an oversight. Collectively, they painted a picture of systematic financial impropriety. "Rebecca." Uncle James removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "These are serious allegations against your father." "They're not allegations," I corrected. "They're facts. And they involve my mother's gallery as well. The question is, did you know?" Uncle James's silence was answer enough. "I see." I nodded slowly. "And the trust? The one supposedly split evenly between Meline and me?" He sighed heavily. "I advised against the amendments your parents made 5 years ago. Amendments that redirected 80% of the assets to Meline," I stated flatly. It wasn't a question. I'd found those documents 3 years ago, hidden in my father's home office during a rare moment when the house was empty. Your father claimed it was justified by Meline's greater financial needs due to her career in nonprofits compared to your more lucrative field in architecture. Uncle James's tone made it clear he hadn't agreed with this reasoning. Daniel leaned forward. "Were these amendments executed properly? With all required notifications to beneficiaries?" Uncle James held my gaze. "No. Rebecca should have been formally notified of any changes to her inheritance." "That's what I thought," I said quietly. The meeting continued for another hour as we methodically went through each document. By the end, Uncle James looked years older, the weight of professional and familial ethical violations heavy on his shoulders. "What do you intend to do with this information?" he finally asked. I closed my portfolio. "That depends on what happens next." As Daniel and I left the building, my phone vibrated with an incoming call. Meline's name flashed on the screen. I answered on speaker. "How dare you go behind our backs to Uncle James?" she hissed without preamble. "Dad just called me, completely beside himself." "What kind of sick game are you playing?" "I'm not playing games, Meline. I'm simply bringing truth into the light. By digging up ancient history? By threatening our parents? Is this all because they missed your stupid wedding?" I felt a familiar surge of anger, but controlled it. This isn't about the wedding. It's about a lifetime of unequal treatment, lies, and now, potentially illegal financial activities. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You've always been jealous of me, and now you're trying to destroy our family because of it. Do you have any idea what you're doing to Mom? She's practically hysterical." "I noticed Dad called you immediately," I observed. "Interesting that neither of them has called me directly." Because they know you've lost your mind. Look, whatever you think you found, whatever grievances you're nursing, just stop. Let's talk about this like adults. I'd love that, I replied evenly. How about dinner tomorrow night? The four of us, you and Brett, me and Daniel. Neutral territory at Le Chateau in Dobbs Ferry. There was a pause as she considered.
Fine.
8 o'clock. And leave your little folder of evidence at home. See you then, I said, and ended the call. Daniel looked at me questioningly. That's not part of the plan. Plans evolve, I replied. And I want to give them one more chance to acknowledge the truth before I take this further. The next evening, Le Chateau's private dining room provided an elegant backdrop for what promised to be anything but an elegant conversation. Meline and Brett arrived 15 minutes late, her standard power move, and I could tell immediately that she had been crying. Brett looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his tie as we exchanged tense greetings. Let's order first, Meline suggested, her voice brittle. I'd rather not discuss family matters on an empty stomach. We made it through appetizers with superficial conversation about the restaurant's renowned wine selection and Brett's recent promotion. But as our main courses arrived, Meline could no longer maintain the facade. All right, Rebecca. Say what you came to say. I set down my fork. I want acknowledgement of the truth. About how I've been treated by our parents compared to you. About the financial irregularities in Dad's practice and Mom's gallery. About the trust that was secretly restructured to your benefit. Meline's face flushed. You're delusional. Our parents have always loved us equally. Please don't insult my intelligence, I interrupted quietly. We both know that's not true. You've been the golden child since you were born. My achievements were footnotes. Yours were celebrated like national holidays. That's not my fault, she protested, but there was a new uncertainty in her voice. I never said it was your fault. But you've been complicit. You've enjoyed your position as the favorite. You've never once stood up for me or acknowledged the disparity. Brett cleared his throat. If I may, Meline has actually mentioned feeling uncomfortable with how your parents treat you, Rebecca. Meline shot him a warning look, but he continued. She's brought it up several times, especially after family gatherings. She just didn't know how to address it without seeming ungrateful for her own relationship with them. This revelation momentarily threw me off balance. I had never imagined Meline having any awareness of the situation, let alone discomfort with it. Is that true? I asked her directly. Meline's eyes filled with tears. What does it matter now? You're obviously determined to tear everything apart. Dad says you're threatening some kind of financial expose that could ruin him professionally. Mom hasn't stopped crying since yesterday. Is that what you want? To destroy our family? I want the truth, I insisted. And some measure of justice. Justice? She laughed bitterly. What does that even look like to you? Do you want them to start treating you as the favorite? Do you want a public apology? Money from the trust. I want them to acknowledge what they've done, I said firmly. Both to me personally and potentially to others through their financial misconduct. And yes, I want the trust restored to its original terms. Brett looked confused. What financial misconduct? I turned to Meline. You haven't told him? Her silence spoke volumes. Your fiancé's parents have been engaging in some creative accounting for years, I explained to Brett. Tax evasion, insurance fraud, misappropriation of charitable donations. Stop it. Meline slammed her hand on the table, causing the silverware to jump. You have no proof of any of this. I have documentation dating back 15 years, I corrected. Uncle James has seen it and confirmed its legitimacy. Brett's face had gone pale. As a banking executive whose reputation depended on absolute financial propriety, this revelation clearly disturbed him deeply. Meline, he said slowly. Is this true? She looked trapped, her eyes darting between Brett and me. I don't know the details of my parents' finances. But you knew something wasn't right, I pressed. You must have. You've been much closer to them than I have. A tense silence fell over the table. Finally, Meline's shoulders sagged. There were conversations I overheard, she admitted quietly. Dad telling Mom that certain donations needed to be structured properly. Mom mentioning that gallery sales sometimes needed to be recorded creatively for tax purposes. I didn't want to know more. Brett pushed his chair back slightly, creating physical distance from Meline. His expression had hardened. And the trust? I asked. Did you know they had restructured it in your favor without informing me? Meline nodded almost imperceptibly. They told me it was because you were doing so well financially on your own, and I would need more help establishing myself. And you didn't question that? Even knowing how hard I've worked for everything I've achieved. Tears spilled down her cheeks. What was I supposed to do, Rebecca? Turn it down? Tell them they were being unfair to you when they'd finally decided to put me first in something? Her words hung in the air, a startling admission that she had indeed been aware of the preferential treatment all along. What happens now? Brett asked, his voice strained. These allegations could have serious implications for everyone involved, including Meline by association. I pulled out my phone and showed them an email draft addressed to Diane Lowenstein, the journalist I had contacted. Attached were scanned copies of the most damning documents in my collection. This goes out tonight, I said, unless we can come to an understanding. Meline looked at me with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. What do you want? A family meeting. Tomorrow. Everyone present, you, me, Mom, Dad, Uncle James. A full acknowledgement of both the emotional and financial truths. A legal restoration of the trust to its original terms. And a plan for Mom and Dad to quietly rectify the financial improprieties before they're discovered externally. And if they refuse? Brett asked. I met his gaze steadily. Then the email goes out, and what happens next will be beyond any of our control. Meline's phone rang. Our mother's ringtone. She answered, her voice immediately shifting to the bright, carefree tone she always used with our parents. Hi, Mom. Yes, I'm with Rebecca right now. Actually, we need to talk. All of us. Tomorrow. She glanced at me. It's important. Trust me, you and Dad need to be there. As she continued the conversation, I felt a strange sense of calmness descend. For the first time in my life, I had tilted the family power dynamic in my direction. Whatever happened tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same. And as I watched my sister nervously arranging the details of our family summit, I realized that the golden pedestal she had occupied for so long had become its own kind of prison, one that had prevented her from developing the strength and independence I had been forced to cultivate in the shadows. The real revelation wasn't just the financial misconduct I had uncovered or the preferential treatment I had documented. It was the recognition that in their misguided attempts to create a perfect daughter, my parents had damaged both their children in profoundly different ways. The family meeting was set for noon the next day at my parent house. As we left the restaurant, Meline caught my arm. You've been planning this for years, haven't you? She asked quietly. I nodded. Some people keep journals. I kept evidence. I never thought you'd fight back like this, she admitted. I always saw you as the quiet one, the one who would just accept things as they were. That was your first mistake, I replied, confusing silence with weakness. As Daniel and I drove home, my phone buzzed with a text from Uncle James. Your father called. He knows what's coming. Be careful tomorrow. Cornered people can be dangerous. I showed Daniel the message. Phase 3 complete, I said. Tomorrow, we reach the endgame. Are you ready for whatever happens? He asked. I thought about the years of careful documentation, the strategic patience, the quiet determination that had brought me to this point. I've been ready my entire life, I answered. Part 4. The morning of the family meeting dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within me. Daniel and I had spent hours reviewing my documentation, organizing it into clear, irrefutable evidence that even my parents couldn't dismiss. As we drove to the Sinclair family home, the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach, but it was different now. No longer fear of rejection, but anticipation of long overdue closure. Remember, Daniel said as we pulled into the driveway, no matter what happens in there, you've already won. You've reclaimed your narrative. I squeezed his hand in silent gratitude. My parents' house looked different somehow, smaller, less intimidating, its perfect facade suddenly transparent to my eyes. We were the first to arrive, a strategic decision to prevent my parents from controlling the physical arrangement of the meeting. My mother opened the door, her usual composure noticeably fractured. Her eyes were rimmed red, her smile strained to the breaking point. "Rebecca," she said, her voice catching slightly. "And Daniel, please come in." The living room had been arranged for a formal meeting. The dining chairs brought in and placed around the coffee table, water glasses set out, even a plate of untouched pastries that seemed absurdly out of place given the circumstances. My father stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid, his expression carved from stone. He gave a curt nod in my direction but didn't speak. "Melanie and Brett should be here shortly," my mother said, filling the uncomfortable silence. "And James called to say he's running a few minutes late." "That's fine," I replied, taking a seat that faced both my parents directly. "It gives us a moment to talk privately first." My father finally broke his silence. "If this is about the wedding, Rebecca, I think we've made our position clear." "This isn't about the wedding," I interrupted calmly. "The wedding was merely a symptom of a much deeper problem, one that has existed in this family for as long as I can remember." "And what problem would that be?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "The systematic favoritism shown to Melanie throughout our lives. The emotional neglect I've experienced as a result. And most recently, the financial improprieties I've uncovered in both your business dealings." My mother sank into a chair, her face ashen. "I don't know what you think you've found, but tax fraud," I stated flatly. "Charitable donation fraud, insurance billing fraud, and illegal manipulation of the family trust." I placed 4 folders on the coffee table, each labeled accordingly. "I have copies of everything. Uncle James has reviewed them and confirmed their authenticity and the seriousness of the legal violations they represent." My father's face flushed with anger. "How dare you spy on your own family, breaking into private files, making wild accusations?" "I never broke into anything," I corrected. "Every piece of documentation I have was obtained legally through careful observation, public records, and information that was carelessly left accessible. And they're not accusations, they're facts." The doorbell rang, cutting through the tension. My mother practically fled to answer it, returning moments later with Melanie and Brett, both looking as though they hadn't slept. Behind them came Uncle James, his briefcase clutched tightly in one hand, his expression grave. Once everyone was seated, an uncomfortable silence descended. My father finally broke it, his voice tight, with controlled fury. "Apparently, my daughter has decided to blackmail her own family based on financial matters she doesn't fully understand and perceived slights she's been cataloging since childhood." Uncle James cleared his throat. "Robert, I've reviewed Rebecca's documentation. This goes well beyond perceived slights. Both the emotional issues and the financial irregularities are real and substantial." "You're taking her side?" my father demanded, betrayal evident in his voice. "I'm acknowledging the truth," Uncle James replied steadily. "Something this family has struggled with for a very long time." I opened the first folder. "Let's start with the emotional issues, since those formed the foundation for everything that followed." For the next 30 minutes, I methodically presented evidence of the pattern of favoritism, photographs, transcripts of conversations I had recorded, side-by-side comparisons of how similar achievements by Melanie and me had been treated differently. My parents attempted to interrupt several times with dismissals and justifications, but I continued calmly, completing the presentation I had prepared. "Do either of you deny this pattern?" I finally asked. My mother looked away, unable to meet my gaze. My father's jaw worked silently, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Melanie, to my surprise, was the one who spoke. "They can't deny it," she said quietly. "I can't deny it either. It was always there, always obvious. I benefited from it, and I never spoke up." She turned to me, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Rebecca. I should have said something, done something." The simple acknowledgement, something I had never expected to hear, hit me with unexpected force. I had prepared for continued denial, for anger, for counter-accusations. The genuine remorse in my sister's voice momentarily disarmed me. "Thank you," I managed to say. My father found his voice. "If there were differences in how we treated you girls, it was never intentional. Meline simply had different needs." "Dad, stop," Meline interrupted. "That's not true, and we all know it. Rebecca was always more independent, more capable, and instead of being proud of that, you both resented her for it. You liked that I needed you more." My mother began to cry softly, her carefully applied makeup creating dark tracks down her cheeks. I moved to the second folder. Now, regarding the financial issues. What followed was a detailed presentation of the various financial improprieties I had documented over the years: altered tax records, inflated charitable donations, incorrectly coded medical procedures that resulted in higher insurance payments, and the secretly restructured family trust. By the time I finished, my father's anger had given way to a pallid fear. Brett looked physically ill, and Uncle James was making notes with grim determination. "What do you want?" my father finally asked, his voice barely audible. "First, acknowledgement," I replied. "Not just private acknowledgement here among family, but a genuine recognition of how your treatment has affected me over the years." "And then what?" he pressed. "Public humiliation? Financial ruin? Is that what will satisfy you?" "No," I said firmly. "What I want is change. Real, substantial change, both in how this family functions emotionally and how you conduct your business affairs." I outlined my terms: a formal amendment to restore the trust to its original equal distribution, a comprehensive plan, overseen by Uncle James, to quietly rectify the financial improprieties before they attracted external attention, and regular family therapy sessions to address the decades of emotional damage. "And if we refuse?" my father asked, though the fight had gone out of his voice. Uncle James answered before I could. "Then, as your attorney, I would be forced to advise you that the evidence Rebecca has compiled would almost certainly result in criminal charges if it reached the proper authorities. At minimum, significant financial penalties and possible suspension of your medical license." My father seemed to age years in moments, the proud, imposing figure suddenly revealed as a frightened man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. "Robert," my mother said, reaching for his hand, "we need to agree to Rebecca's terms." "Listen to Mom," Meline added. "For once, she's right." The family meeting continued for hours, working through each point of my proposed resolution. Uncle James drafted preliminary documents for the trust amendment, which my parents signed with shaking hands. A schedule was established for addressing the financial issues, with Brett unexpectedly offering his expertise to help navigate the complex corrections needed. As evening approached and the initial agreements had been reached, an exhausted calm settled over the room. The pastries remained untouched, the water glasses empty. "There's one more thing," I said, as we prepared to leave. "Going forward, I expect to be treated with the same respect and consideration that Meline receives. Not because I've forced your hand, but because it's what every child deserves from their parents." My mother rose from her chair and, in a gesture that stunned me, embraced me awkwardly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know if we can fix everything, but I want to try." My father remained seated, still processing the seismic shift in family dynamics. But he nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that carried more weight than any words he might have offered. As Daniel and I drove home in the gathering twilight, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: vindication, exhaustion, lingering anger, but also, unexpectedly, hope. "Do you think anything will really change?" Daniel asked. "Some things already have," I replied, thinking of Meline's apology, my mother's embrace, the signed documents in my bag. "The rest will take time." Over the following months, the carefully structured plan unfolded. The trust was officially restored to its original terms. My father, under Uncle James's guidance, began the painstaking process of correcting years of financial improprieties, a task that would cost him significantly in back taxes and penalties, but would ultimately protect his license and reputation. Most surprisingly, the family therapy sessions, which I had expected everyone to resist, revealed depths to our family dynamics that even I hadn't fully understood. My mother's overwhelming favoritism toward Meline stemmed partially from her own childhood as the overlooked daughter in her family. My father's fixation on creating a perfect family image was rooted in deep insecurities about his humble beginnings. And Meline, beneath her confident exterior, had developed a crippling fear of failure precisely because so much of her identity was wrapped up in being the golden child. 6 months after our confrontation, Meline and Brett's wedding day arrived. Unlike my ceremony, this one was attended by the entire family. As I helped my sister with her veil, a gesture she had tearfully requested, she squeezed my hand. "I never would have had the courage to do what you did," she admitted. "To stand up to them, to demand the truth." "You never had to develop that kind of courage," I replied, without bitterness. "But you're finding your own strength now." It was true. In the months since our confrontation, Meline had begun establishing boundaries with our parents, making decisions that reflected her own desires rather than their expectations. Her wedding, while beautiful, was notably smaller and more personal than the extravaganza our parents had initially planned. As we stood together reviewing last-minute details, my mother approached, her expression hesitant. "You both look beautiful," she said, her eyes moving between us with equal warmth, perhaps for the first time in our lives. After the ceremony, during the reception, I found myself momentarily alone with my father. He had been more resistant to change than my mother, his pride making it difficult for him to acknowledge the harm his behavior had caused. "Your sister looks happy," he said, watching Meline dance with Brett. "She is," I agreed. "I think she's finally figuring out who she is outside of being your perfect daughter." He flinched slightly, but nodded. "And you? Are you happy, Rebecca?" The question surprised me, not just its content, but the genuine interest behind it. "I'm getting there," I answered honestly. "A lifetime of patterns doesn't change overnight. But I'm no longer living in shadows, my own or anyone else's." He seemed to consider this carefully before speaking again. "I'm beginning to think that perhaps you were the stronger one all along." It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But for my father, it was an unprecedented acknowledgement. That night, as Daniel and I returned to our apartment, I deleted the drafts of emails I had prepared for the journalist, the regulatory agencies, the ethics board. They had served their purpose as leverage, but the real victory wasn't in punishment or public exposure. It was in the painful but necessary truth that had finally been brought to light. I also deleted the surveillance app one had installed years ago, the secret recordings I had accumulated, the documented evidence of every slight and dismissal. I wouldn't need them anymore. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked, watching me remove the last traces of my years-long investigation. "Yes," I said, feeling lighter than I had in years. The truth doesn't need to hide in shadows anymore. In the months and years that followed, our family slowly built something new from the ruins of the facade that had collapsed. It wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, old habits that resurfaced, painful conversations that needed to be had again and again. But underneath it all was a foundation of honesty that had never existed before. Meline and I developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than competition. My parents, with ongoing therapy, learned to see and value both their daughters for who we actually were, not who they had decided we should be. And I discovered that freedom from the need for their approval allowed me to accept their love when it was genuinely offered. The architect in me recognized the fundamental truth that had emerged from our family's painful reconstruction. Sometimes the most beautiful structures are built not from pristine, untouched materials, but from pieces that have been broken, examined honestly, and thoughtfully reassembled. Our family would never be the perfect image my parents had once so desperately cultivated. But in its place was something far more valuable, a family built on truth, with room for all of us to stand in the light.